challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Samueli. It is now 9:10 p.m. in the kind of dark and muggy Central European city of Budapest. I'm not really complaining. It's the cold and the wet and the short days that get me down. So hot, muggy, that's not anything that worries me too much. So thank you everybody who has joined me for the Thursday night live stream, and I should say that it is 3:11 p.m. on the east coast of the United States, where there have been some very dramatic developments during the day. So I want to talk a little bit about that, which is the out in the open clash between Trump and outgoing Doge chief Elon Musk, which has now got quite nasty. And this was obviously highlighted during the extraordinary presser that took place today between President Trump and Chancellor Friedrich Merz. And so I want to talk a little bit about that, and then I want to talk about the discussion about Ukraine that Trump and Merz engaged in. So, as you know, Musk left his position as head of Doge last Friday. And he was supposed to, because according to government contracts, you kind of have to you can't stay longer than, I don't know, whatever, I think it's 130 whatever days or something like that. But anyway, his time had expired, and in theory he could have continued on that status that he enjoyed. But clearly Trump didn't particularly want him to stay on. So, sorry, I was reading Ever Ready says Russia's UK ambassador has told Sky News that Ukraine's recent attacks risk escalating the conflict to World War III, as he partly blamed the UK. I mean, yes, of course, it's all of that is true. I have to be blunt. I get so tired of these Russians, issuing these warnings. I mean, just do it already. Take the risk for World War III, but just simply saying every time some Russian red line is crossed that, well, this is risking World War III. I mean, it's really become almost like a joke. Anyway, back to the situation with Musk. So, as I say, 130 days, and in theory, he could have asked for an extension, or at least a new 130-day status as a special employee. He didn't. Though there is some indication that he wanted to, but he didn't, because I think he felt with some justice that Trump was going to say no. So we know, but basically what's now happened, what the sudden explosion that took place really in the last few days, is over the Trump's big, beautiful bill that, according to Musk, does nothing to address the deficit. Of course, one can also say that Musk himself, after all the big hoopla about Doge, really didn't recommend any huge cuts, the kind of big cuts, $2-3 trillion that he had promised. And Trump claims, and we'll have to see whether that's so, claims that his tariffs will address the issue of the deficits. Well, we'll see about that, but that's the Trump claim. That's the Scott Bessent claim. Is that the deficits are nowhere near as bad as the Congressional Budget Office claims, as Musk claims, because we'll be getting all this money from tariffs. But a couple of days ago, like earlier this week, there was a very interesting article in Axios. This is the insider's insider in Washington. That actually is pretty. It's a pretty good publication. It's published by the same people who founded Politico. Now, Politico is just unbearable. It's just the neoliberal claptrap. There's nothing of the slightest interest in Politico. But Axios is quite interesting. So let's first of all take a look at what this article said. So this is before. This was published 2 days before this current explosion, which we're going to come to. And here is here's the article. Scoop. 4 reasons Musk attacked Trump's big beautiful bill. And here we have the sources familiar with the Trump-Musk relationship say there appear to be 4 inflection points that led to his caustic attack on Trump's bill. The legislation cuts the electric vehicle tax credit. Obviously, that hits Musk where it hurts. The legislation cuts the electric vehicle tax credit that helps car makers like Musk's Tesla. As of late April, his company had spent at least $240,000 lobbying on behalf of the credit and other company matters. Behind the scenes, sources say, Musk also advocated for the measure in the legislation, but to no avail. So that's one reason for his disgruntlement. But one should also say this comes, on the train of a number of other conflicts that had bedeviled the relationship between Trump and Musk. You remember back in December, Musk started going on about the H-1B visas. Well, he was a huge fan of the H-1B visas and suggested that he and many other companies, innovative companies, needed to bring in workers from all over the world because America just wasn't producing the kind of educated, high qualified workforce that could serve a company of his of the genius and innovativeness and far-seeing vision of Tesla, X, and the rest. Now, Trump initially seemed to side with him because Trump himself in his companies had made use of the H-1B and he'd made use of the H-2B, which is a little bit different, but that deals with them. Gardeners and agricultural workers and so on. So he initially seemed to side with Musk and the guy who was Musk's partner in Doge, Vivek Ramaswamy. And but then, of course, MAGA unleashed its fury on Musk over the H-1B visas. They said, because after all, this is part and parcel of Make America Great Again. America first. Hey, if there's a good job going, we want Americans to get those jobs. We don't want those jobs going to people from the Indian subcontinent. They should go to Americans. That's really at the very heart of MAGA and protecting the American workforce and protecting American products. That's protectionism. That's the that's what America First is all about. So that was already one issue that that caused tension, and then Musk backed away and said, I mean, I think H-1B needs to be reformed. I'm for it in principle, but the way it's working now, isn't satisfactory. It just needs to be reformed. So that kind of put that conflict on the back burner. But then, when Trump started introducing tariffs, um, the Musk really began to get very nervous for obvious reasons. I mean, his stuff, his Teslas are produced in China, and the tariffs are going to hit his cars, and so he really wasn't at all happy about the tariffs. Um, though I hard to know why exactly he would have been surprised. Trump talked about tariffs all of the time during his campaign, even before that, and particularly on the issue of China. I mean, basically, Musk worked very collaboratively with the Chinese government, and he produced his cars in China. And so, obviously, whatever tariffs Trump was going to hit on China was going to affect imports of Tesla. So he was clearly Musk was very unhappy about all of that. And then, but rather than take Trump on directly on the tariffs, Musk unleashed on Peter Navarro. So much so that he called Peter Navarro a moron. And I can't remember the exact phrase. I think he's dumber than a sack of rocks. And then he added, and that's an insult to a sack of rocks, or something, really not a nice thing to say about somebody who, after all, has a PhD in economics from Harvard. But Musk did that, and so that was already from those comments on the tariffs, on the comments on Peter Navarro. We knew that this relationship was heading for the skids. Anyway, so we go back to this article in Axios, and here we have the tax credits for the electric vehicles gone. Musk clearly is unhappy. Then Musk was working at the White House as what's called a special government employee. That was his status. And he had discussed trying to stay in that role beyond the 130-day time limit set by the statute for the unpaid advisory position. But ultimately, White House officials said he couldn't keep serving in that capacity. And then the third issue, Musk also wanted the Federal Aviation Administration to use his Starlink satellite system for national air traffic control, but the administration balked at it because of the appearance of a conflict of interest and for technological reasons. You can't have air traffic control just run off satellites. Okay, so that's the third issue. Again, it brought to bear, what people had said from the start, that, he has this governmental position, but he's also, the richest man on earth, and he's a very big entrepreneur. And not only that, he does a lot of contract work for the U.S. government. So there was an obvious conflict of interest that was going to come up in no time at all. And then the final straw for Musk appeared to come Saturday night when Trump abruptly announced he was withdrawing the nomination of Jared Isaacman, a Musk ally, to be NASA administrator. So that was, and Trump explained, he said, well, this guy is a Democrat, and while, we can definitely hire Democrats, we won the election, and it's part of it's part of the perks of winning an election is you give these big jobs to your political allies. So tough luck, buddy. um, no matter how qualified you may be. So, but what then happened was that with this big, beautiful bill. So, I remember on Friday, when which was Musk's last day in office, it was a very amicable um, parting. It was a joint news conference in the Oval Office, and Musk was kind of joking around, and indeed taking Trump's side against the New York Times, because it was, the New York Times had written the story about that he was using drugs, um, that ketamine, uh, that exactly what exactly it is. It's a kind of a painkiller that he was using. The one that actually killed that actor, well, because he was taking it in such great quantities. Matthew Perry, so ketamine. Anyway, um, and this was brought up in this news conference, and Musk, you know, disparaged and spoke, that about the New. Oh, you mean that New York Times, the New York Times that lied about RussiaGate and perpetrated the RussiaGate hoax, and obviously music to the ears of Trump. Um, Now, what then happened is that we knew that Musk wasn't happy with the big beautiful bill. Um, um, uh, but Vic Shakapopoulos, good to see you. Ketamine is a painkiller indeed, but for horses. Well, yes, I mean it is. I mean it's a it's a bloody powerful thing. I mean, if it's a horse is that's a bloody big animal. So I mean, if he's going to need a hell of a lot more of a painkiller than we would. But yeah, I mean, I guess like all things, it probably is quite nice in in moderate quantities, but in excess, it's a killer. Um, but that was the allegation he was using there. So he then went off on this tirade against this big beautiful bill, um, which again, I mean, that does indeed raise the issue of, well, he was supposed to urge these big government spending cuts. That was the whole point. He was going to recommend these massive spending cuts, and we didn't really get any of those. I mean, it's hard to know exactly what spending cuts he did in fact urge, but it doesn't look as if it amounted anything more than a couple of billion here and there. So none of that has really materialized. Anyway, here was this. He sent out. This was about a couple of days ago. He sent out this tweet, or this X, and he said, "I'm sorry, but I just can't stand it anymore. This massive, outrageous, pork-filled congressional spending bill is a disgusting abomination. Shame on those who voted for it. You know you did wrong. You know it." So this is Trump's bill. So while he's having a go at Congress, it's nonetheless Trump's bill. It's his big, beautiful bill, the big tax and budget bill. And then he said, goes on, call your senator, call your congressman. Bankrupting America is not okay. Kill the bill. And then came the it will, and then he said, it will massively increase the already gigantic budget deficit to $2.5 trillion, burden American citizens with crushing, unsustainable debt. And then Congress is spending America into bankruptcy. And then here's his, he sent out this meme, which is obviously a picture from Tarantino's film from about 20 years ago now, Kill Bill. So Kill the Bill. That's the joke. And now What then happened is that, of course, during the press availability in the Oval Office with Trump and Friedrich Schmerz, Trump was asked about Musk, naturally, and let's see how he responded. Where are we? I think, yep. So here's Trump on Musk.
Things that we're doing, nobody's ever seen anything like it. And Elon's upset because we took the EV mandate, and which was a lot of money for electric vehicles, and they're having a hard time with the electric vehicles, and they want us to pay billions of dollars in subsidy. And Elon knew this from the beginning. He knew it for a long time ago. That's been in there. That's been, I would say, JD, that hasn't changed. That's been right from the beginning, Mr. Secretary. That hasn't changed at all, right from the beginning. But I know that it disturbed him. He wanted, and rightfully, he recommended somebody from that he, I guess, knew very well. I'm sure he respected him, but to run NASA. And I didn't think it was appropriate. And he happened to be a Democrat, like totally Democrat. And I said, look, we won. We get certain privileges, and one of the privileges we have to appoint a Democrat. NASA is very important. We have great people. General Kane is going to be picking somebody with our. We'll be checking him out, seeing. But he wanted that person, a certain person, and we said no. And I can understand why he's upset. Remember, he was here for a long time. You saw a man who was very happy when he stood behind the Oval desk. And even with the black eye, I said, do you want a little makeup? We'll get you a little makeup. But he said, no, I don't think so, which is interesting and very nice. He wants to be who he is, so you could make that statement too, I guess. Look, Elon and I had a great relationship. I don't know if we're well anymore. I was surprised because you were here. Everybody in this room practically was here.
This interestingly is quite a painful admission, but also a very honest admission on Trump's part. He says, well, I don't know if we will have a good relationship in the future. Now, I actually think that it's possible that he will, because while Trump can get angry and rage against people who have crossed him, he's also quite forgiving, and he doesn't let grudges cloud his judgment. Remember when Steve Bannon was essentially fired by Trump quite early on during his first term, and that was because Bannon had talked to this journalist, Michael Wolff. And Michael Wolff, as might have been expected, wrote a very unflattering book about the Trump administration. And Trump, understandably, was pissed off with Bannon, and Bannon was gone. And he sent out these very nasty tweets about Bannon, sloppy Steve. That was his the name that he referred to Bannon, sloppy Steve. And then Bannon was kicked out from Breitbart, and it seemed for a while that he was gone. That Bannon's position in the conservative world was now no more. Everyone wanted really to distance themselves from him. But Bannon did something very smart, which is he didn't allow himself to be provoked by Trump. He didn't respond in kind. He didn't say anything nasty about Trump. On the contrary, he continued assuring the world that he and Trump were really all together, and there's no daylight between them. And he continued to defend and to champion Trump, and then he went off to Europe and tried to organize kind of various Trumpian movements in Europe with, shall we say, mixed success. Um, but by sticking with him, by saying no, I'm absolutely, there's nothing. No divisions between us, he was able to worm his way back in to Trump's good graces, and now I imagine he is, he's a key advisor to Trump. He wasn't offered a job in the new administration. We don't know exactly why that was, but he didn't offer him a job. But you see, that's where the difference is between, say, Ann Coulter, who was with Trump in 2015, 2016, but then fell out with Trump and then started attacking him, saying very nasty things about him, calling him a moron and idiot and so on. And that meant that she was never really going to get back into Trump's good graces. Even though I think she supports his new administration, but basically that's it. She's out of the Trump orbit, which means she doesn't really have any cachet, and that's why I think Ann Coulter is a sort of a rather sad figure. A person from yesterday. I mean, she's not really part of MAGA and the whole where it's at now on the political right in America. So it's a question now. So it's quite possible that if Musk now drops all these attacks on Trump, that he could get back in with him and even get another job in the administration in about a year or so's time. If, however, he continues with these attacks, then I don't think that's very likely. Anyway, let's go back to Trump's presser. Anyway, he goes on.
We had a wonderful send-off. He said wonderful things about me. You couldn't have nicer. He said the best thing. He's worn the hat. Trump was right about everything. And I am right about the great, big, beautiful bill. We call it a great, big, beautiful bill because that's what it is. And again, biggest tax cuts in history, biggest economic development moves anywhere. We've never done anything like it. Business is spurred. And I don't know if you've seen the numbers, but the numbers came out. Even the CBO, which is run by Democrats, said that we're going to be doing, I'd like you to discuss it, the 2.8 trillion, that CBO. This is a group of people that are Democrats. They're very hostile to us. They just came out with phenomenal numbers, what it does. You want to mention that, sir?
Yes, sir. So what we've seen is we keep hearing from the CBO that there's going to be a large deficit from the bill, which we disagree with, but using the CBO scoring, they came out and scored the tariff revenue. We think it'll be the minimum of 2.8 trillion over the 10-year window, which actually puts the bill in surplus if you include the tariff revenue, which they won't do.
It gives you a tremendous surplus, but we're not allowed to use that. For some reason, they say scoring. Nobody knows what scoring means. Maybe a couple of people, but nobody. Somebody sits in the background. They say, well, we're not going to allow that. They're not allowing other things that we have that are tremendously profitable for our country. But if you saw the other day, CNBC, they came out with numbers, and the people on the show, very good people, I've watched them for a long time, they couldn't believe the numbers, how good they are. The numbers were incredible. And that was personal income and also very low inflation. We have very low inflation. We're down to 2% now. And maybe.
All right, it goes on a little bit here. Let's move on and skip ahead a little bit.
1% have zero for certain reasons that are. And one of the things I ran on was that. I ran on the border. We have the best border in the history of our country, 99.99%. It was. Last week, 3 people came in, 2 of them for medical reasons. We let them in because one of them had a heart attack. I think it was a nice thing to do, and one of them had something else. So we've never had, I had very good numbers. for 4 years, but we're really topped it. And I want to thank Christie and Tom Holman. They've done a fantastic job, but nobody mentions that anymore. Remember, a few months ago, the border was a total disaster. People were coming in by the hundreds of thousands of people a day, a week, a month. I mean, we had a month, 2 million people came in 1 month. The border was being overrun, and a lot of bad people, criminals, murderers, drug dealers. We had some of the worst people in the world coming in from all over the world. It's totally closed. And you know what? People are coming into our country, but they're coming in legally. So we've done a great job. Elon knew that. Elon endorsed me very strongly. He actually went up and campaigned for me. I think I would have won. Susie would say I would have won Pennsylvania easily anyway, even if the governor ran, the real governor.
Watch that. Now that was the thing he said there. He campaigned for me in Pennsylvania, but I would have won in Pennsylvania anyway. And I said, watch that, because that's going to come up in in these tweets that Musk sent out. Anyway, let's go back.
Not the governor from Minnesota, he's a sick puppy, that guy. That poor guy, I feel sorry for him. But they made a bad choice with him. But if you pick Shapiro or anybody else, I spoke to him recently about his house being set on fire, which was terrible. But if they picked him, I would have won Pennsylvania. I won it by a lot. But I'm very disappointed because Elon knew the inner work.
So I'm just looking here, and Robert says that RT just broke a story that Musk alleges a Trump-Epstein connection. So that's obviously something that's happened since we started the podcast, because I didn't see that on. I'm assuming that comes up on somewhere on Musk's Twitter account. So he obviously posted that after we began the podcast. Okay, so that's interesting. Okay, let's go on.
Of this bill, better than almost anybody sitting here, better than you people. He knew everything about it. He had no problem with it. All of a sudden, he had a problem, and he only developed the problem when he found out that we're going to have to cut the EV mandate, because that's billions and billions of dollars, and it really is unfair. We want to have cars of all types, electric. We want to have electric, but we want to have a gasoline, combustion. We want to have different. We want to have hybrids. We want to have all. We want to be able to sell everything. And when that was cut, and Congress wanted to cut it, it became a little bit different. And I can understand that. But he knew every aspect of this bill. He knew it better than almost anybody. And he never had a problem until right after he left. And if you saw the statements he made about me, which I'm sure you can get very easily, it's very fresh on tape. He said the most beautiful things about me. And he hasn't said bad about me personally, but I'm sure that'll be next.
I love this. He hasn't said anything bad about me personally, but I'm sure that will be next. It's like, yeah, I mean, that's no question. It's like he knows, hey, I know the arc. When people have a falling out, first they criticize things mildly, and then soon they're on cable denouncing me personally, and like all of these characters who are now all constantly quoted in the New York Times, even in an article I think today or yesterday, again trying to suggest Trump is anti-Semitic, Trump is an admirer of Hitler, Trump sits reading Mein Kampf. And all of this comes from very dubious sources, and they get repeated ad nauseum to the point that just if you keep repeating something long enough, then people just give up resisting. So it was John Kelly, that Trump's former White House chief of staff, who made this allegation about how Trump was supposedly an admirer of Hitler's. No one else has ever said that. But Kelly said this, And the New York Times just keeps regurgitating this, even though there's no evidence other than John Kelly's word for it. There's no record anywhere of Trump having expressed an admiration for Hitler. And and then the New York Times did this thing with the the familiar routine of, oh, he had Nazi sympathizers to dinner at Mar-a-Lago and all this nonsense. But that's the way you just keep repeat it. So that's why we were reading now. Musk is saying something about Epstein, and it's quite possible that Musk is going to say, yeah. I mean, he also told me about Hitler.
I've helped Elon a lot.
To that end, Mr. President, I just want to clarify, did he raise any of these concerns with you privately before he raised them publicly? And this is the guy you put in charge of cutting spending. Should people not take him seriously about spending now? Are you saying this is all sour grapes?
No, he worked hard and he did a good job. And I'll be honest, I think he misses the place. I think he got out there and all of a sudden he wasn't in this beautiful Oval Office, and he's got nice offices too. But there's something about this one. I was telling the Chancellor, this is where it is. People come in here, even from Germany. They come in and they walk into the Oval Office, and it's just a special place. It's World War I. It started and it ended here, and World War II, and so many other things. Everything big comes right from this beautiful space. It's now much more beautiful than it was 6 months ago. A lot of good things are happening in this room, and I'll tell you, he's not the first. People leave my administration and they love us. And then at some point they miss it so badly. And some of them embrace it and some of them actually become hostile. I don't know what it is. It's sort of Trump derangement syndrome, I guess they call it. But we have it with others too. They leave and they wake up in the morning and the glamour's gone. The whole world is different and they become hostile. I don't know what it is. Someday you'll write a book about it. You'll let us know. Yeah,
seems like brilliant.
So that was Trump today at the presser with Schmerz, and we're going to come back to that because then he talked about Russia and Ukraine, and he said some interesting things. But Musk was watching this. He's sitting there watching it in real time, and he was enraged, and he unleashed on his Twitter account, and so let's go back to that. So here we have this. It's very hard to see, but he's basically collected all of these. Or somebody, he's just retweeting somebody who's collected statements from Trump going back to I can't see, it's so small, 2013, when he was denouncing budgets that with budget deficits much smaller than the current one. And back then, Trump was ferocious in his opposition to budget deficits. And so Musk says, where is this guy today? And then he goes on, Musk sends this out. Is it time to create a new political party in America that actually represents the 80% in the middle? Now, this is one of these really dumb ideas that, we really want a party that represents the 80% in the middle. And who is this middle? It's, just these deficit hawks who are generally hated in the country, because deficit hawks usually means they're going to cut public services. And they've more or less been in charge for decades. I mean, this idea that new political party, but that's been the consensus, because whether it's Bill Clinton or George W. Bush and then Obama, Trump, it's more or less the same kind of party um, in power. It's known as neoliberalism. Um, they favor corporate interest over individual interest. They favor essentially, like Musk, the H-1B visas, bringing in cheap labor from abroad, unrestricted immigration, and of course the belligerent foreign policy. Um, and yeah, they run deficits, but that's just simply because they provide they just simply don't raise the kind of revenue that's needed in order to pay for the services that they provide. But because of America has the prerogative of the reserve currency, and it can shift the burden of the deficits onto the rest of the world, because the rest of the world always wants to invest in the American economy. They always want to buy treasuries. America can go on with these deficits. Now, at some point, the bill comes due, and there's no question the bill will at some point come due. But this what he's advocating here, this 80% in the middle, it's not like that we haven't had precisely presidents one after another. That was the consensus, that 80% in the middle. Um, and then Musk goes on. The big ugly bill will increase the deficit to 2.5 trillion. And then he says here that yeah. And then this is where he got. This is where Musk really crossed the line, because remember we said that Trump raised the issue of, well, he campaigned for me in Pennsylvania last October, but I would have won anyway. And then Musk responded to that: without me, Trump would have lost the election. Dems would control the House, and the Republicans would be 51-49 in the Senate. Such ingratitude. Now, this was a serious, catastrophic mistake on on Musk's part, because you never say to a political candidate that I did this for you. I without me you would have lost. You never say that, because it's the candidate who runs for office. He's the one who puts his name out there. He's the one who campaigns. He's the one who's out there fighting for votes. You can help him. You can give him money. You can give advice and whatever, but you never say, "Oh, without me, you would have lost." That's a real insult to a political candidate, and above all, it's also untrue, because it's the candidate who wins. It's the candidate who wins or the candidate who loses. It's on him. It's not on the campaign manager. It's not on his staff. It's not on the donors. It is on him. So he's the one who did this, and so that to say you would have lost without me, that's a fatal error. And really stupid people make that kind of mistake. I mean, he's not a stupid person, but he showed a real lack of judgment, lack of maturity in doing that. When you have these campaign manager, like that horrible woman who was always on Fox News, Kellyanne Fitzpatrick. I think she goes by the name of Kellyanne Conway these days. And she postures. She's an absolutely creepy woman, because she's actively involved in as a political consultant. So she has clients, and she's a pundit. So she basically is double dipping. She goes on Fox News pretending to be a disinterested pundit, but she's really soliciting clients for her business. So she gets a whacking great paycheck from Fox News, and then she gets a whacking great paycheck from the clients that she uses Fox News to solicit. But she um, is the is the a classic case of saying, "Oh well, I was running um, Trump's campaign in 2016." You never say this, even though she was the campaign manager. You never say, "I was running the campaign." You are a staff person. You don't run anything. It's the candidate who runs the campaign. You are a staff person. And anyone who does that, it really shows a total lack of judgment and kind of dumbness. It's like, David Frum, who declared, "Oh, I wrote that speech about the axis of evil." I mean, apart from the fact that the speech was a terrible, the idea of taking credit for a horrible speech, George W. Bush, about the axis of evil, but you never say, any speech writer never takes credit for a speech because it's the president's speech. But anyway, just going back then to Musk, for Musk to say, "Oh, without me he would have lost," that's really going to infuriate Trump, and that may prevent him from ever returning to Trump's good graces. Anyway, let's go back to Musk's tweets. Such ingratitude. So, and then Trump had said, "I'm very disappointed with Elon. I helped him a lot. He knew the inner workings of the bill better than anybody sitting here. He had no problem with it. All of a sudden, he had a problem, and he only developed a problem when he found out we're going to cut the EV mandate." And then Musk says, "False. False." You don't want to say false to Trump if unless you're planning on a final break with him. "False. This bill was never shown to me even once, and was passed in the dead of night so fast that almost no one in Congress could even read it." Well, that's always the case, incidentally, with these bills. And then here Musk goes, "Whatever, keep the EV solar incentive cuts in the bill, even though no oil and gas subsidies are touched, but ditch the mountain of disgusting pork in the bill." So he's saying, "Fine, I don't care that you took out the tax credits for the electric vehicles, but hey, what about the subsidies for oil and gas?" And then in the entire history of civilization, there's never been a legislation that is both big and beautiful. Everyone knows this. Either you get a big and ugly bill or a slim and beautiful bill. Slim and beautiful is the way. And now Trump, after this Twitter storm, issued a couple of truths of his own later in the day. In fact, just before we went on the air, it says, "The easiest way to save money in our budget, billions and billions of dollars, is to terminate Elon's governmental subsidies and contracts. I was always surprised that Biden didn't do it." So here he says, "Hey, I've got a great idea of how we can save some money. Let's terminate Elon's subsidies and contracts." And then Trump goes on, "Elon was wearing thin. I asked him to leave. I took away his EV mandate that forced everyone to buy electric cars that nobody else wanted, that he knew for months I was going to do, and he just went crazy." So that's it. It's wearing thin. The wearing thin was also what the that Axios article said. He's wearing thin. Um, Now, the problem for Musk is that, as I say, he was a staff person, and he was working at the pleasure of the president. He can't now present himself as if somehow an independent player, an independent actor. I mean, he can do it, um, but I mean, there's nothing to stop him from doing it. But ultimately, um, Trump is the one who was the candidate. He was the one who ran for office, and he's the one who's been entrusted to do this. You know, put together budgets, taxes, whatever. Everything that's his is all up to him. Um, Trump asked him. He said, "Hey, you know how to run a business. You obviously know how to cut the fat of a company. We saw what you did at Twitter. You whatever it was, 80% of the staff at Twitter he fired, and Twitter continued to function smoothly. So I said, well, you obviously got this expertise of cutting fat. Why don't you try doing that with government?" And that's it. So, but Musk really just doesn't. Ultimately, it's the president who puts forward budgets. He's the one who puts forward tax cuts or tax increases. Um, None of that had anything to do with Musk. Musk's position, he was hired to do something very specific, not to pontificate about the budget. That wasn't what he was hired to do. He was hired to do was cut the fat of government. Identify waste, fraud, and abuse, and then that waste, fraud, and abuse can be eliminated. That's that you're supposed to be this brilliant entrepreneur, this successful businessman, and you run these companies. Here's the government. Identify waste, fraud, and abuse, and see if we can save some money. And that's it. And so all the rest for him now to go on about pork and whatever, that had nothing to do with what he was asked to do. And so, as things stand, um, Richard Phillips says, I predicted that Musk would be out pretty quick. He's too high profile for Trump to tolerate for long. Well, obviously that's true, and I think I predicted. I think we have the Gaggle. Both Peter and I predicted this that he's not going to last for very long. I thought Musk would play his hand a bit more shrewdly than he did. I mean, I guess, look, if you're the richest man on the planet, and you have these successful, you're a very successful businessman. You think, hey, I'm more important than presidents. I count. I matter more than the president of the United States does. I mean, presidents come and go. They only hang out for 4 years, less than that, because the election campaign begins midway through a presidential term, and then everyone's already focused on the who's the next man in. So you say, hey, I'm going to be around in years to come, while Trump will be back in Florida writing his memoirs. So I can see why he would think it, but yeah, I think he hasn't played his cards particularly well. And then so that's the one issue that I wanted to talk about. The other thing was was which they touched on with Schmerz, was of course Russia and Ukraine. Now, as you know, yesterday we had this telephone conversation between Trump and Putin, We still don't know exactly who initiated this. Was it the Russian side or the American side? But nonetheless, there they were. There was the conversation, and obviously, what what mattered, and why I think the American side in particular wanted to discuss, was, well, how are the Russians going to respond to this attack on their strategic bombers? Because the finger is obviously going to point towards American involvement. The Americans knew the locations of the strategic bombers. They knew about the airfields. They knew which airfields housed these strategic bombers, and the Americans had to provide the satellite technology, and ultimately they had to provide the satellite technology in order for these drones to avoid Russian air defenses, and that's the point of it. You need the satellites to guide the drones or the missiles in order to evade the Russian air defenses. So once they did this, once this attack on the strategic bombers took place, then we obviously we were waiting for how the Russians going to respond, but of course we were also waiting for, well, what's Trump going to do? What's Trump going to say? Trump, he's not shy about speaking his mind, but that was Sunday. He said nothing on Sunday. Monday, nothing on Monday. Tuesday, nothing. I mean, there's nothing. He didn't say anything. This, after having sounded off last week for some strange reason, because that Russia was attacking Kiev, and he felt that somehow he needs to sound off on these attacks, which was very strange, because there's nothing special going on taking place last week for him to suddenly weigh in on, and particularly when he seemed remarkably uninformed on the issue of the Ukrainian drone attack on President Putin's helicopter, which was in Kursk. That was that's quite a big deal, and so therefore there was the Trump seemed not to know about that. But anyway, here finally on Wednesday, Trump sent out a truth declaring that he had just spoken on the phone with Putin. Remember, all the previous, this is the fourth telephone conversation between Trump and Putin since Trump's return to office, and this one was not scheduled. All the previous telephone conversations had been scheduled well in advance, so it came as a surprise when he suddenly sent out this truth saying that he had spoken to Putin. So here, this is. Let's see if I can deal with this problem. All right. So this is good. Let me then pull this up just to see this. What Trump said. And here he says, I just finished speaking by telephone with President Vladimir Putin of Russia. The call lasted approximately 1 hour and 15 minutes. We discussed the attack on Russia's docked airplanes by Ukraine. And and also various other attacks that have been taking place by both sides. So it's very important to remember the Russians haven't said anything at all about this attack on these airplanes on the airfields. I mean, they acknowledged that it happened. The Ministry of Defense said yes, it had happened, but they obviously minimized the damage caused by the drones. But other than that, there were no condemnations. So while the Russian government has been vehement in its condemnations of the attacks on the railroad bridges in Kursk and Bryansk, which led the one in Bryansk that led to the death of 7 passengers. So the Russians have been speaking very, very loudly and vehemently about that attack. They've said nothing about this attack on the strategic bombers. But here, Trump brings that up. We discussed the attack on Russia's docked airplanes by Ukraine, and also various attacks that have been taking place by both sides. It was a good conversation, but not a conversation that will lead to immediate peace. And I think, I did a podcast on this yesterday, and I mentioned that this is the most pessimistic that I've ever heard. Trump's nearly always saying, yeah, we're on track. Everything's going well. We're close to a deal, and so on. Here, not a conversation that will lead to immediate peace. So he's not even saying, well, maybe if Putin and I can get to meet, wherever in Vatican City, maybe we can thrash this out. So here it says, President Putin did say, and very strongly, that he will have to respond to the recent attack on the airfields. So here Trump is pretty much saying that Putin is going to attack or in response to what Ukraine did, and that really there's nothing much that he can or is willing to do about it. He says, well, they're going to just do it. They're going to just attack. That's the way it is. That's what Putin said that they will do. Now, keep in mind, Putin and no one in the Russian government has said, yeah, we're going to respond, and boy, that's going to be a very tough response. And then Trump goes on. We discussed Iran, and he asked Russian help on Iran. So we don't have to talk about that for the time being. And then here was the readout from on the Russian side. This was from Ushakov. So it wasn't a usual readout. This was actually Ushakov made this announcement to the media, and it says that how did the conversation begin? Naturally, with a discussion of the situation around Ukraine. Vladimir Putin spoke in detail about the results of the second round of direct Russian-Ukrainian negotiations in Istanbul. And then these negotiations was emphasized. Ukraine tried to disrupt by tried to describe by carrying out on direct orders, and again targeted attacks on purely civilian targets on the peaceful population. This is qualified as terrorism. So again, just as Putin, who spent almost the entirety of his long meeting yesterday with members of his government talking about this Ukrainian attack on these railroad bridges. So here's Ushakov again talking about this, even though Trump, in his truth, made no mention of this. And then I would like to emphasize that the president spoke in detail about the content of the negotiations, their results, and emphasized that overall these negotiations were useful. The corresponding memoranda exchange will be analyzed in the capitals, and then, as we hope, the parties can continue the negotiations. So actually, the Russians are now sounding a little more optimistic than Trump had in that truth. And then here we have, As for the strikes on military airfields, this topic was also touched upon. Moreover, Donald Trump reaffirmed that the Americans were not informed about this in advance. Um, that's it. And that's the sum and substance of what Ushakov or the Kremlin have said about that attack. Just okay. The Americans reaffirmed, and it is reaffirmed that they had no advanced knowledge of this attack, and this corresponds with all of the Western media reports since Sunday, when they all said no, the Americans were obviously not involved in this attack and had no advanced knowledge of this attack. Now, the extent of the American knowledge, involvement, we can certainly discuss that and debate that. The one part that I think, what I would say categorically, is that I really don't think Trump knew about this in advance. I don't think they told Trump in advance, for the obvious reason that you never want to tell a president about very delicate, embarrassing, dangerous, clandestine, covert operations. You never want to tell the president, first of all, if you tell the president, hey, we have got this plan and it's quite dangerous, the president's going to say, nah, I don't think so. I mean, because ultimately, if this blows up in our faces, I'm going to be the one who's going to carry the can. I'm responsible for it. So I don't think it's a great idea. Moreover, but even if he gives the go ahead, then if it goes badly wrong, then it's a big embarrassment for the president, which is what happened to JFK after the Bay of Pigs debacle. He admitted that he signed off on the invasion of Cuba. Now, it was planned, obviously, before he came to power. It was planned in the Eisenhower administration, but nonetheless, he was the one who signed off on it. And therefore, he was the one who got lambasted throughout the world for having signed off on clearly an illegal action, into an invasion of a sovereign country. So either you get your president, you tell the president, he says no, and therefore it doesn't happen, or the president says yes, and then he just blows up in his face, or the president is forced to lie about it. I mean, Kennedy could have lied about it. But then, of course, that's a problem, because if you lie about it, and then the lie is found out, and generally lies are found out, then it's a doubly problematic, because not only did you sign off on a half-baked plan, but then you lied about it, and that's never a good look for any political leader. Then when he's caught essentially lying, just as Anthony Eden in 1956 was caught having lied to Parliament about essentially colluding with Israel and France on an invasion of Egypt. So therefore, the whole thing was a lie, and that brought his political career to an end. So that's why I don't think anyone notified Trump ahead of time. But the extent of the American involvement, that's going to be quite interesting. The America denies that they had advanced knowledge, but when you look at how they formulated it, it's always, if you're a lawyer, you can ride a coach and horses through it. Did you have advanced knowledge? When did you have advanced knowledge? In the days before, you had advanced knowledge a couple of months before, advanced knowledge 6 months before. So, nobody really knows. And so therefore, but the Russians have said, well, that's what the Americans told us. So the Russians aren't saying that we believe the American denials. They just say, well, the Americans have denied it. They haven't presented contrary evidence to suggest that we don't believe their denials. They've just said, well, the Americans have told us that they had no advanced knowledge. And that's understandable because the Russian position at the moment is that they want to maintain good relations with Trump. Maybe certainly not with the Europeans, certainly not with Kiev, but they want to maintain good relations with Trump, so that they don't want to suggest anything that the Trump administration was involved in this, that had advanced knowledge, so they don't really want to suggest it. They've done, if relations were poor, they may well have said, yeah, you know what, we don't actually believe your denials. Remember, when it came to Nord Stream, the destruction of Nord Stream, the Russians have never had any hesitation in accusing the British. They accused the British directly of being involved in the blowing up of Nord Stream, but they also blamed the Americans. They said the Americans were directly involved. But in this case, they just said, okay, Trump has denied this. Anyway, let's go back to the news conference with Schmerz today. That's not it. Here we are.
Speaking of ending wars in history, you were very critical of Vladimir Putin a couple of days ago. What kind of play has he played with respect to what I said?
Well, look, he got hit. He's been doing hitting, so I understand it. But he got hit hard, and I don't think he's playing games. I think I've always said he wanted the whole thing. I thought he wanted the entire everything having to do with Ukraine. That's something that would have never happened if I were president. The election was rigged. I didn't get to be president, but I got to be president now. And I think it's a much more important presidency. Other than a couple of things like that, the war would have never happened. The war with Ukraine, with Putin, would have never happened, ever, not even a chance. And it didn't happen for 4 years. And it wasn't thought of. I used to talk to him about Ukraine a lot. It was the apple of his eye, but he would have never done what he did. And I think mistakes were made by him, but I think mistakes were made by other people. The president should have never allowed that. Biden should have never allowed that war to happen. If you had the right guy in here, that war would have never happened. Israel would have never happened with Hamas. That would have never happened. The attack on Israel would have never happened because Iran was broke. They had no money. They had no money to give to Hamas or Hezbollah or anybody else. And all of that would have never happened. Inflation wouldn't have happened. It was caused mostly by energy. And the Biden administration messed up my great energy.
So here, he's saying, familiar themes. Oh, it would never have happened had I been president. As a matter of fact, I think it's true. I mean, it may get really boring having to hear this over and over and over again. But I think it's true. I don't think it would have happened. And not because he's so tough or all this stuff, peace through strength, and Putin was afraid of me and all this. It's not because of that. I don't think Trump would have pursued the reckless policy that Biden pursued in 2021. I don't think he would have pushed for the immediate induction of Ukraine into NATO, which is what Biden was pursuing. I mean, there's no question that's what Biden was doing. In 2021, October 2021, Lloyd Austin, defense secretary, goes to Ukraine, he goes to Georgia, and he says the door to NATO membership is wide open. Seeing that clearly they were moving forward with this. And I don't think Trump would not have done that. I think Trump would have known instinctively this is a really bad idea, Ukraine in NATO. I think he would have stayed away from that. I think he wouldn't have pushed for it. And I think when Putin presented those two ultimatums or draft agreements to NATO and to the U.S. administration, I I think Trump would have taken it seriously. I mean, I'm not saying he would have agreed to it, he wouldn't have signed it or anything. I think he would have taken it seriously. He would have probably initiated a meeting with Putin. So, maybe they can have a summit to discuss this, and then put together some kind of a global conference to iron out issues about the security on the Eurasian landmass, something like that. He would have taken it seriously. He wouldn't have just simply ignored it contemptuously in the way that Biden did. So I think it is true. I think what Trump is saying, it wouldn't have happened had I been president. I think that's right. I think he wouldn't have done.
Policy. We were down into the 190 a gallon, and it would have never happened. It was caused by energy and their bad spending on the Green New Scam and other things that they spent on. But all of those things would have never happened. But maybe most importantly, the war, Chancellor, with Russia would never have happened with Ukraine. It was something that would have, I dealt with Putin a lot. There was no chance, zero. And, a lot of people say, how do you know? For 4 years it didn't happen. There was never a chance of it happening. And he understood the consequences. Now, it's a shame. I mean, when you see all of those people.
Note, Schmerz is sitting there glowering. He's not at all happy with this. I mean, Schmerz is one of the most belligerent warmongers in Europe now. And so he's not at all happy with hearing any of this. He wants to be told Russia's really evil. Russia invaded Ukraine, and we need to join forces to fight this evil. That's his view.
They came out with a report today that millions of people died, much more than people thought. And I've been saying that for a long time. The amount of death in that war is far greater than the news has been reporting, or frankly, that either side has been reporting. It's a very sad thing. And I can tell you, just speaking for the chancellor, because we speak about it, he feels the same way. He wants to see it ended. Would you like to say something?
Absolutely. And I'm here, Mr. President, to talk with you later on how we could contribute to that goal. And we all are looking for measures and for instruments to bring this terrible war to an end. And may I remind you that we are having June 6th tomorrow. This is D-Day anniversary, when the Americans once ended a war in Europe. And I think this is in your hand in specific, in ours.
That was not a pleasant day for you?
No, that was not a pleasant day.
This was not a great day.
In the long run, Mr. President, this was the liberation of my country from Nazi dictatorship.
This is a hilarious moment from Trump's part. Well, it wasn't a great moment for you, but of course, for any post-war German chancellor said, "Well, no, it was great because, of course, it was the liberation of our country from Nazism." But Trump said, "Well, hey, well, this is Germany. It couldn't have been very nice for you as a German, because I don't know." Your parents or your grandparents, I mean, they were around, and couldn't have been nice for them. It's just Trump has this knack of blurting things out. Hey, we have to have the official line. Oh, yeah, no, it was fine because we were liberated from Nazi rule. Thank you very much for the United States.
And we know what we owe you, but this is the reason why I'm saying that America is again in a very strong position to do something on this war and ending this war. So let's talk about what we can do jointly, and we are ready to do what we can. And you know that we gave support to Ukraine, and that we are looking for more pressure on Russia. The European Union did, and we should talk about that.
We will talk about it. Yeah. It's good timing. The numbers for our country are through the roof.
No, he says we have to. What's the plan? More pressure on Russia. In other words, everything that you've been doing for the past 3 years, we need to do more of that. More pressure on Russia. He says this to Trump. It's not at all what Trump is saying. Trump says, "Oh, we need to bring this thing to an end." They say, "Yeah, we got to bring it to an end." How? By putting more pressure on Russia. So the same old policy that has been a staggering failure all this time?
The economic numbers, because of the election and because of tariffs and other things, a lot of things. But we've had some of the best numbers we've ever had. They were reported yesterday, the day before, and even today. Country is doing really well. I think that one of the things you'd be most interested in is that 6 months ago, we were having a hard time getting anybody to join our military. I mean, they just couldn't do it. The numbers were record low. We couldn't get people to join the military. It wasn't me. This was before I got there, the past administration. But 6 months ago, a year ago, the numbers were record low. You couldn't get them to join. That included the police. And you couldn't get them to join. Now, we just hit the highest number in the history of our country, we think, but very close, but the highest in the history of our country, recruitment. Joining the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, Coast Guard, police forces all over the country.
What did you do for them? What was the
spirit? They love our country again. You're going to do the same thing. Spirit.
Mr. President,
we have great spirit is back in our country, and it's very simple. You know, it was only, Susie, 6 months ago, right? That you got reports. You're the one that released them that you couldn't get anybody to join the military, and now we're stocked. Every service now is packed, and we have waiting lists of people trying to get in, as good as we've ever had in the history of our country. So that's an honor. That's a great honor.
Mr. President, on the war.
You've asked. You've had enough. Go ahead, please.
Mr. President, so would you consider to put more sanctions on Russia? Because this discussion is going on now for weeks and months, and you tweeted about it once, but then nothing happens.
It's always there. So we now have more pressure on Russia. Would you consider putting more sanctions on Russia? That's the only thing these journalists ever asked. They never ask anything about, hey, how can you we move towards some kind of a settlement? You know, how can, maybe, as a mediator, maybe you could put forward a plan and, see if somewhere, you can find some halfway house between the Russian plan and the Ukrainian plan, something like that. Oh, sanctions. Oh, what are you going to put sanctions? When are you going to do it? When are you going to put real pressure on Putin?
When I see the moment when we're not going to make a deal, when this thing won't stop,
is there a deadline?
At that moment, yeah, it's in my brain, the deadline. When I see the moment where it's not going to stop, and I'm sure you're going to do the same thing, will be very, very, very tough. And it could be on both countries, to be honest. It takes two to tango. But we're going to be very tough. Whether it's Russia or anybody else, we're going to be very tough. That's a bloodbath that's going on over there. And when I see the moment where I say, well, they're going to just keep fighting. I gave the analogy yesterday when I spoke to President Putin. I had a 2-hour, 15-minute call with him. Sometimes
So in that truth that he said, that was a 1 hour, 15 minutes. Now it's a 2 hour, 15 minutes. But this, so first of all, remember, note what he just said. Oh yeah, it can get tough. We could impose sanctions on both sides. Both sides. The question that was asked, and this is the point the media always say, well, what are you going to do about Russia? What are you going to do about Putin? It's on both sides. Trump is explicitly not following the kind of the media script on this. So then listen now to this analogy.
This is me speaking, maybe in a negative sense, but sometimes you see two young children fighting like crazy. They hate each other and they're fighting in a park. And you try and pull them apart. They don't want to be pulled. Sometimes you're better off letting them fight for a while and then pulling them apart. And I gave that analogy to Putin yesterday. I said, President, maybe you're going to have to keep fighting and suffering a lot because both sides are suffering before you pull them apart, before they're able to be pulled apart. But it's a pretty known analogy. You have two kids, they fight. Sometimes you let them fight for a little while. You see it in hockey. You see it in sports. The referees let them go for a couple of seconds, let them go for a little while. before you pull them apart. And
What you do now,
maybe, and I said it, and maybe that's a negative because we're saying go, but a lot of bad blood. There's some bad blood between the two. I have to deal with it, and the chancellor has to deal with it. It's incredible. The level of, there's a great hatred between those two.
So notice what he just said. He was saying earlier, we need to bring this thing to an end. We need to bring this terrible fighting. And then he says, but maybe we should just sort of step back and allow this war to continue. And he said, well, it's like these children. Maybe we should just allow the children to keep fighting. That's a distinctly different from what he has been saying before. So maybe we should just step back and allow it to continue. I always thought that might be the shrewdest move on Trump's part, because at the moment, Russia is certainly, yes, it's kind of making advances, but it's not really making advances at any pace that would alter the war's dynamics anytime in the near future. At this rate, one or two villages, every week or so, it's gonna take a long time just to take control of the four oblasts, Donetsk, Lugansk, Kherson, and Zaporozhye. I mean, the progress is really slow. It's still Donetsk, Kherson, Zaporozhye. It's still 70% under Russian control, but 30% isn't. So that's going to take a while. But once that's done, I mean, if Russia can indeed push the Ukrainian forces out, then I think a settlement would be much easier. But at this stage, Russia demanding that Ukraine withdraw its forces from the four oblasts without Russia having actually pushed them out, without Russia having the strength to push them out, I think it's just unrealistic. I mean, if you can't do that, you can't push them out using your armed forces. It's a little much to expect the Americans to do it for you. And I think that's a lot of the people who are on alt media seem to think that somehow it's the responsibility of the US administration to do for Russia what Russia doesn't seem able to do for itself. Oh, yeah, right. Well, absolutely. Trump should tell Zelensky to move his forces out of the oblast. So, well, he's not going to do that. Whether that, I mean, I think that's something that it's desirable. That's a desirable outcome. But the Americans are not going to do it for Russia. I mean, that's just ridiculous. I mean, to expect Trump to do this for the Russians. So, but if the fighting continues, then that might happen. It might be that Russia will gain that advantage, and at least bring those oblasts under the control of Russia, and that might be a kind of a point at which a settlement becomes possible. But at the moment, while it's still the oblasts are still being fought over, it's hard to see how that they can reach a settlement. I mean, there are ways of doing it, involving changes in the Ukrainian constitution, limitations on armed forces, limitations on foreign forces, and so on. That might be one way of doing it, but that doesn't seem feasible at the moment. But if at least Russia can secure that, that would be a way of saying, okay, well, now we can this war can be brought to an end. So when Trump says this, it's like he's thinking aloud and saying, well, maybe we should just let this continue. And then once we let this continue, then we can reach a point where finally, okay, we can just draw lines in the map and say, well, that's it. This is the new border. We don't recognize it internationally; it's not going to be recognized. But we've drawn up the new borders, and we now have a basis for a settlement. Anyway, let's go on.
between those two men, but between the warring parties, great hatred.
What made you say and believe apparently that there's no immediate peace?
What?
That there's no immediate peace.
Well, I can't. I'd love to have immediate if I could.
But
if I could, but we don't have immediate. It's like I'd love to have that. I'd like it to start right now. We would leave a room if we knew the war could end. We'd say, forget about you guys. Forget about trade, right?
Yeah.
We'd say, let's go settle it. There's some additional fighting that's going to go on. He attacked, and they attacked pretty harshly. They went deep into Russia, and he actually told me. I mean, I made it very clear. He said we have no choice but to attack based on that, and it's probably not going to be pretty. I don't like it. I said, don't do it. You shouldn't do it. You should stop it. But again, there's a lot of hatred. And, I'm very proud of the fact that with India and Pakistan, I was able to stop that. And those are nuclear powers. That was getting close to being out of hand. And I spoke to some very talented
Go on a little bit further.
You're spending all this money to defend you against Russia, and then you're giving Russia billions of dollars a month. What kind of a deal is that?
This is Trump on Nord Stream.
Better than anybody else. I appreciate it. But I'm the one that stopped it. And that was the biggest economic development job, if you want to call it that, in the history. Think of it. In the history of Russia, that was it's the biggest pipeline in the world. Going to go all over Europe, not only to Germany. They're Germany, but then they were branching off all over to Europe. Nobody ever heard of it. Not one person of you heard of it. And I stopped it. It was dead. And then they say, I'm friends with Putin. I got along with him. He respected me. I respected him. It would have never happened. But I stopped Nord Stream 2. When Biden came in, almost the first week, he approved it. He let it be built. And then they say that I wasn't tough on Russia. Putin said to me, you're not tough on Russia. You stopped the biggest, most important job we've ever done. You stopped it. And Biden came in and he let it be built. And I'll tell you what, I'll never forget the day I had it totally stopped. They weren't building. They gave up on it. They weren't able to. And then Biden came in and he let it build. I couldn't believe it. Okay, one or two questions more, please. Any question for the chancellor? Go ahead for the chancellor. I like his answers much better.
Will you continue to support Ukraine?
Yeah, I'm with Ukraine. We just signed a big deal on rare earth with Ukraine, and I want to. You know what? I'm for stopping killing. Really, that's what I'm for. Again, a war that would have never started, should have never started. I want to see the killing stop. We spent $350 billion, much more than Europe, but Europe spent a lot also. And they spent way over.
I mean, I want to just listen to Schmertz's comment. He really is very unhappy about all of this. He's being polite, but he doesn't like any of this because essentially Trump is taking the position. Well, I just want this war to end. He's not saying one side is better than the other. One embodies good and the other embodies evil. But that's what Schmerz wants. That's his view. The one, we have the good and the evil, and therefore we have to support the good, and we have to keep this war going so that good will prevail. And that's clearly, absolutely not what Trump is saying.
Over $100 billion. So you're talking about close to $500 billion went into that whole thing, and it's not even the money. And I know with you too, it's a lot of money, but it's the death that's being caused. We went to the Middle East. I went last week to the Middle East. We took in $5.1 trillion. That's many, many times. That's 30, 40 times, 50 times more than what we're talking about. It's think of that, $5.1 trillion of investment with one trip that lasted 4 days. So it's not the money. It's a little the money, but not the money, the big thing. The big thing is the death. The death of, and really the decimation. You've lost the whole culture. Ukraine had the most beautiful turrets. They call them turrets. Little towers, beautiful towers. The most beautiful in the world. They're all now laying on their side, blown to smithereens. It'll never happen again. They've taken away the culture of a country. They've taken away the heritage of a country. It's a terrible thing. But most importantly, again, is the death. 5,000 plus people a week, soldiers, are being killed. He doesn't want that, and I don't want that. One more. Yeah, please.
Mr. President, do you support the Graham bill putting high tariffs?
I have not.
I just wanted to maybe go a little bit, just because Schmerz speaks.
They're waiting for me to decide on what to do, and I'll know maybe very soon. It's a harsh bill, yeah, very harsh.
How about one more on auto, Mr. President? We'll take one more on auto, Ben.
Go ahead.
I would like to have a question to Cassius on this. Do you agree with the analogy that the president made on the war between Russia and Ukraine as being a fight between two kids? Is that how you view that as well? And what do you actually want the US president to do in this?
Well, I think we both agree on this war and how terrible this war is going on. And we are both looking for ways to stop it very soon. And I told the president before we came in that he is the key person in the world who can really do that now by putting pressure on Russia. And we will have this debate later.
Notice again, how does he bring the war to an end? Oh, by putting pressure on Russia. It's just that standard formula. So it's clearly not what Trump is saying, but that Schmerz, it comes in, oh, he can do it by putting pressure on Russia. That's it. That's the go-to solution.
Again, how we can proceed jointly between the Europeans and the Americans. And I think we are having the duty to do something on that now to stop it. After 3.5 years, which is really terrible. Look at the kids, the kids which were kidnapped from Ukraine to Russia. This is all terrible.
The kids that were kidnapped from Ukraine to Russia. So he's peddling essentially a lie. This is a lie. He's peddling Ukrainian propaganda. Kids that were kidnapped. No one was kidnapped. I mean, these were children who were taken out of a war zone, and the Russians have made clear that anybody who wants to return, or if they, a parent or a legal guardian can make, a plausible case, or not plausible case, could present evidence that this wants the child back, then the child will return. But this is a lie. He's putting out this lie Ukrainians have been putting out, and that the ICC put out, that somehow children were kidnapped. No one was kidnapped.
And so we are talking about instruments, measures, what we can do. And my personal view is clear on that. We are on the side of Ukraine, and we are trying to get them stronger.
We are on the side of Ukraine. See what he said?
Stronger, just to make Putin stop this war.
So, and we're going to make Ukraine stronger and stronger, and that'll make Putin stop this war. That's what he said. That's it. That's the whole. He's a man with no ideas at all. He comes in, same thing. Just keep repeating. Oh, we've got to make stronger and stronger, and that's going to bring Putin to the negotiating table.
We get satellite pictures of the warfield, and you don't even like to look at them. Right?
It's terrible.
So,
it's really
bodies, arms, heads, legs, all over the place. You've never seen anything like it. It's so ridiculous.
And this is only by Russian weapons against Ukraine. This has never happened with Ukraine weapons against Russia. Never.
He has never happened. This is all Russian weapons against Ukraine. It's never happened Ukraine weapons against Russia. He says this 3 days after this essentially terrorist attack in Bryansk and Kursk. We've had these assassinations, and we've had civilian attacks. But also, notice what he has done here, what Schmerz has done here. Trump is talking about the battlefields. He's talking about what's going on the battlefields. He didn't talk about, attacks on civilians or anywhere. Actually, there haven't been many attacks on civilians. But Schmerz is willfully misinterpreting what Trump had just said.
Ukraine is only targeting military targets.
Ukraine is only targeting military targets. That's a lie. But that's it. They say, oh, the Russians are targeting civilian targets.
Not civilians, not private, not energy infrastructure. So this is the difference, and that's the reason why we are trying to do more on Russia, how to stop this.
Well, in this case, I'm talking about the battlefield, the soldiers on soldiers. But you could also say that too with the cities.
Yeah.
The cities are being hit also. So it's a terrible, terrible thing, right? Somebody said autopad.
Okay. So that's the I just wanted to show what a really slimy character Schmerz is, and how he is deliberately mischaracterizing, suggesting, only Russia hits civilian targets. Ukraine never hits any civilian targets. It's a lie. They don't target energy infrastructure. A lie. Apart from anything else, energy infrastructure is absolutely a legitimate military target. So so it's lie after lie after lie on Schmerz's part, and that's clearly not what Trump was saying. However, it's very instructive what Trump said there. He says that maybe we should let this war continue, which, to be honest, I mean, it's probably at the moment the optimal solution, because it doesn't look like there's going to be any kind of agreement as the way things stand. So Trump has now changed his position, where he was saying, "Oh, it's going to happen. We're really very close to a deal." He's now saying, "Well, we're not close to any kind of a deal," and he also was saying that he's not supporting the Lindsey Graham's bill. He said, "Well, I will have the last say on the matter. I will have the last say. That Lindsey wants to do this, but they're all waiting for me to make a decision. I will make a decision at some point, but basically, it's going to be up to me as to whether this Lindsey Graham bill goes anywhere." So all the pretense on the part of the Europeans as if somehow the Lindsey Graham bill is a done deal. Well, it isn't a done deal. Anyway, let's go to our locals page, and look at the locals members, the people who really care about the dogs, and how the dogs need to be looked after and fed and kept in good spirit. So I really appreciate everybody who's there. And let me go to the beginning. And Stone River, always good to see you. Thank you very much, Stone River, for your generosity. And Stone River quotes Putin's aid. In our view, the Kiev regime has essentially degenerated into a terrorist organization. Is Russia signaling it is adding a regime change to explicit war aims? Well, that has always been a part of the Russia's war aims. I mean, remember, part of their war aims is a change in the constitution that's making Russian an official language for the first time since 1991. Protection for enshrined in the constitution for Russian speakers, protection for the Russian Orthodox Church, and of course they also insist on having elections in Ukraine, and that there will be no signing of any kind of an agreement before there are elections. So that there has to be a whoever signs on behalf of Ukraine has to be a legitimately elected leader. So regime change always was an explicit. I mean, I think now, I think it was always explicit. That was, when they talked about the Nazi regime in Kiev, the Banderites and everything else. So it was really that was always pretty much an explicit war aim. I think it was the implicit war aim when they launched their special military operation. I mean, the only thing that ever made sense as to what Russia was trying to do was that they would just push forward into Kiev and install some new regime, and there'd be some legal justification for it, because they could absolutely say that Zelensky and the people in power in 2022 had no real legitimacy, that the legitimate regime was that of Viktor Yanukovych. So they had some basis, and I always thought that that's what they were doing. That's why they pushed forward towards Kiev. I mean, that was they rushed towards Kiev. I mean, the only thing that ever made sense was they would move into Kiev, they would catch Zelensky and the rest of them by surprise, and then force Zelensky to capitulate. He would either sign an agreement there and then, instituting a variety of changes, the ones that I've just mentioned, or resign, hand power over to somebody else. So that's what I thought that they were doing. So it's analogous to what the Soviet Union did in Hungary in 56, Czechoslovakia in 68, which was you move in, you install a new regime, and then essentially, yes, you're going to be condemned by the rest of the world, and they're all going to vent their fury, but they were going to do that anyway. But at least you've bitten the bullet and you've done it. You weather the storm for 6 months, and then everyone's gradually forgets about it. I think that was a strategy that made sense. At the moment, what they're doing doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because they're doing some different things. They're trying to do the regime change, but they're also trying to secure these oblasts, and they're also trying to get some kind of a pan-European conference on security. So there's a number of different things that they're trying to achieve, and it's not clear how that this kind of 1 square kilometer a day that they're moving is actually going to get any of those deals done. Anyway, so thank you so much. So I think, I think regime change is a part of the agenda, and I think it's already explicit. I mean, it was more or less said that in that memorandum they presented in Istanbul. Carlos FR, good to see you. Evening, Dr. Samueli and Gagglers. Good evening. What do you think are the biggest misconception in the West about World War II? Well, that's obviously a very good question. I guess I guess the misconception probably is that Hitler always intended to launch this genocidal war. I mean, I'm not saying he didn't, but it's very hard to see if you follow his diplomacy during the late 1930s. He wasn't really thinking along those lines. He was kind of thinking of reorganizing the European continent to essentially make it a German-dominated continent. He believed that Britain and France would sign off on that. And maybe at some point he thought that he would wage a war against the Soviet Union, and then Britain and France would just basically look the other way. But the question was, what was he actually intending to do? I think at all times he was trying to avoid a war with the Western powers. I think that was his key objective, and and it was really incompetent diplomacy on the part of the Western powers that they got themselves into a war that Britain and France certainly could not win. So if you think, well, what's the biggest misconception? The biggest misconception was essentially Britain and France got themselves into a war which they should have avoided, and through, again, a failure of diplomacy, made commitments that they had no means of fulfilling, and on the contrary, would lead them to disaster. Um, and so I think that's the part that was just a misconception. What Hitler's ultimate intentions were, I think, is that's a difficult question. The war that he launched against the Soviet Union in 1941 was clearly triggered by his the fact that he was now stuck with an unfinished war against Great Britain, and because there was an unfinished war against Great Britain, with always the threat of the United States entering the war at some point, and the Soviet Union growing stronger and stronger and stronger because they were industrializing rapidly. In 1941, I think Hitler figured that time was working against him. Britain was going to get stronger. The Soviet Union will get stronger. At some point, the United States is going to get in. And whatever great successes he had enjoyed in 1939, 1940, and the early part of 1941 will count for nothing within a few years. So what then happened was really, in a way, it's like a sequence of events that Hitler probably had not counted on, since he didn't think Britain and France would go to war against him. And therefore, that led him to make that fateful decision of invading the Soviet Union. Would he have done it otherwise? It's hard to know. But I think that the important thing is like if he's asking what's the misconception, I think, is the staggering failure of the diplomacy, and not because appeasement was a wrong policy. That everyone's always said, "Oh, appeasement was terrible." No, appeasement was the right policy. The right policy is always you have to avoid a war. You definitely have to avoid a war against a much stronger power. What you never want to do is to get yourself into a war that you cannot win. And I think that was what the British and the French did, and it was a catastrophe for both countries. Much worse for France, obviously, than Britain, but they were catastrophic. But anyway, it's a big subject, but I think that's I'd say briefly in answer to that. Anyway, thank you, Carlos. Stone River, again, thank you, Stone River, says Trump wants to end the war. Merz and co. want to keep the war going, but pretend they share Trump's goal. How long can the charade of unity go on? That's a very good question. It's an absolute, I mean, as we just watched that presser where Trump was saying one thing, Merz was pretending to be in agreement with him. But in fact, he had a very different agenda. He wanted to continue with the Biden, NATO, Starmer, Macron policy of, well, we got to give everything to Ukraine, and we've got to keep this war going. And this clearly not what Trump wants. And you could see Trump was not in agreement. I mean, you can see Trump is quite masterful at segueing into all sorts of irrelevant issues, but it's a way of avoiding confrontations, avoiding unpleasant questions. But even in that clip, when Merz jumped in with the whole thing about, Ukraine, he doesn't attack civilians. Oh, it's only Russia that attacks civilians. It's all Russia. Russia is the evil power. And, Trump kind of rather dexterously said, well, I'm just talking about the battlefields. These are terrible scenes on the battlefields. But to answer your question, how long can this charade go on? I would think not for very much longer. I mean, I think things are going to have to come to a head. I think there's going to be pressure from Lindsey Graham and the rest of them. And ultimately, if Trump is part of this alliance, this NATO alliance, these are our closest friends and allies, then sooner or later, these close friends and allies, my good friend, the Chancellor, my good friend Merz, they're going to push Trump into supporting their cause. They care passionate about Ukraine. They all come in and they all say this thing about Ukraine. We're for Ukraine, everything for Ukraine. We're determined to keep this war going. And that's different from what Trump is saying. But as long as you hang out with these people, it's like, you lie with the dog and, you get up with his fleas. So you lie with Schmerz, and at some point, you're going to be forced to endorse Schmerz's position. So unless Trump cuts himself off from his good friends and allies, which is very difficult to do because we've got the G7 meeting quite soon, and then we've got the NATO summit quite soon. So each time they do this, we get this affirmation of, Ukraine, Ukraine, Ukraine. What are we going to do about Russia? When are we going to apply real pressure against Russia? It's just going to be difficult for Trump to withstand this. The only way he can do it is if he takes, these negotiations by the scruff of the neck. If he somehow, puts forward some kind of a plan of his own, then now, once you have the Ukraine memorandum or Russian memorandum, and he puts forward a plan of his own. Okay, this is the American plan. Let's see if we can negotiate on that basis. Otherwise, it's very hard to see how he's not going to get sucked into NATO's war. So anyway, thank you so much, as always, Stone River. Ergos says, Trump is now saying he is with Ukraine. He didn't quite say that. I think that may be a little unfair. He said, yeah, I support Ukraine. And then he said that, look at this deal that we said, this rare earth deal that he talks about. That doesn't mean he supports Ukraine's war objectives, or, he's ready to send, all this weaponry and everything else that the Europeans want. I mean, everything that's being sent to Ukraine now is all appropriated. It was appropriated by Biden. There's been no new appropriations. We'll see what happens. When it'll come time for new appropriations. We'll see whether Trump throws his weight behind that. Anyway, so Trump is now saying he's with Ukraine, together with the BBB, the Big Beautiful Bill, being full of pork, and the deficit ceiling being raised again, and Musk's noisy departure. Does this represent a turning point in Trump's presidency where he falls back in line and betrays MAGA? Well, I think it's too early to say. I mean, the BBB is, yes, it's full of pork, but Trump is still making the case, and we'll see whether that's the case, that he's got all these tax cuts, and they talk about, yes, tax cuts for the rich and so on. I mean, there is that. In all Republicans have that, the tax cuts for the rich, but there are tax cuts for the middle class as well. There's the no tax on tips, no tax on Social Security. So he does have those tax breaks in that bill. He also has the tariffs. He's claimed that he's going to raise a lot of money on the tariffs, which will offset um, the loss of revenue from these tax cuts. We'll see whether that happens. We'll see whether these tariffs will materialize and they'll be sufficient to offset the losses in revenue. The debt ceiling. I mean, I just think that's one of those most tedious things. I mean, I don't know why they have that debt ceiling, because they always raise it. I mean, it's like, oh, we're going to raise the debt ceiling, and what do you know? They're going to raise it. So why even bother with it? I mean, just forget about it. I mean, you're always going to raise it. So the question is, does it represent the turning point in Trump's presidency? I think the turning point will come if he puts his weight behind Lindsey Graham's sanctions bill, if he appropriates new funds for Ukraine, if he decides to really start, escalate the provision of intelligence to Ukraine, and of course, if he decides to attack Iran, if he decides to join Bibi in attacking Iran, I think that will be the moment when we can say, yep, he's definitely betrayed MAGA. He hasn't done it yet, but the signs are not good. I mean, it's like a couple of weeks ago, it seemed like we were on the brink of a deal on Iran. Now we seem to be as far away as ever. When it comes to Russia and Ukraine, I think it's the jury is still out. You could see the way he was warding Schmerz off today. He wasn't endorsing Schmerz's position. That means he's not endorsing NATO's position. So he's still trying to carve out some distinctive position of his own, whereby he's going to be try and balance out between Russia and Ukraine without throwing his weight behind one or the other. That's important for him to somehow. Well, I'm not really throwing my weight behind one or the other, but it may be that in practical terms, he's going to be behind Ukraine. And I think if that happens, that will be a betrayal of MAGA. But more important, I think it'll be the demise of his presidency. I think he'll just stagger out as yet another failed presidency. And Ergos, so thank you very much, Ergos. Appreciate it. Vic Shakapopoulos, who says, Dear George, I wasn't entirely satisfied, oh dear, with your answer on the Cyprus question. First, I don't believe enosis was a crazy idea. Well, when I say it was crazy, let's look at the history of Cyprus. Cyprus belonged to Turkey. It was Turkey owned the island. The British took the island off the Ottomans for their own naval interests. They made Cyprus into a naval base. When they built it into a naval base, a lot of Greeks started arriving in Cyprus, and they soon became a majority population. I mean, it's a fairly usual task. But Greece's claims to Cyprus are pretty thin. It's entirely a kind of a demographic claim, because it had belonged to the Ottomans. I mean, the British had taken it off the Ottomans. It was through coercion. The British were much stronger than the Ottomans through coercion, and they turned this into an important base for the Royal Navy. Then the Greeks started arriving. So Greece's claims to it are thin. And always, whenever you make a demographic claim, it's never that convincing, because you can say, well, yeah, but you kind of changed the demography artificially. I mean, it's the same with Kashmir, where you changed it artificially. The Muslims started arriving, and soon they became the majority population in Kashmir. They weren't there originally. Or in Kosovo, how did it come about that Kosovo suddenly became an overwhelmingly majority Muslim province? Well, because the Albanians just undertook a massive illegal immigration into Kosovo. There was no real control, and they just moved in and took it over. Up until relatively recently, the Serbs had been, if not the majority, but at least it was proportionate, in terms of Serbs and Albanian Muslims. Um, Now, you said that Enosis was crazy. Well, it was crazy in the sense that the Turks were not going to accept it. So if you're going to do this, if you're going to launch this coup in Cyprus, overthrow Archbishop Makarios, who basically just kept that island together. You have the Greeks, you had the Turks, and he knew how to keep it together. He was a slippery character, but an effective leader, which is why the British appointed him as the president of Cyprus. But he had tried to keep these Greek nationalists under control, and he tried to keep the Greek nationalists under control because he wasn't because of the Turks. The Turks were never going to accept Greece taking Cyprus over. The Turks still saw Cyprus as theirs. It had been a part of the Ottomans. So that's why I think it was a crazy idea, because it provoked the Turks, and once the Turks were provoked, and there wasn't really any countervailing resistance, then Greece was onto a hiding to nothing. The Greeks were onto a hiding to nothing. No one was going to come in and save them. Now, I don't think the Turks behaved well, to say the least. There was no justification for the invasion, because the Turkish Cypriots were not under any threat, and the Enosis idea was squashed immediately. And Makarios was restored immediately. So there was never any kind of a serious threat of Enosis, serious threat of the Greeks taking over the island. I mean, there was nothing. The Turks saw this as an opportunity. They made their move, and that's why 50 years on, they're there, and unlikely to be any major changes. Anyway, so I don't believe Enosis was a crazy idea. Well, as I say, I mean, the Greeks' claim to Cyprus wasn't very strong. It would be according to the right of self-determination of nations. It's not. That's not entirely true. I mean, you got, yes, in terms of in line with demography, but there are other cases. I mean, where somebody has a historic attachment. So, as I say, if let's say Kosovo. Now, in the case of Kosovo, the Albanians make the claim on the basis of demography. Hey, we're the majority of population. We want an independent state. The alternative for that is saying, yeah, but it had been a part of Serbia. Serbs regard it as their historic origin of their nation. It's part, it's rooted in the history of the Serbs. They cannot let go of it. So, and since generally, I mean, here at the Gaggle, we tend to support the Serbian side, the embracing the cause of demography, and that demography is going to decide who gets to enjoy independence. It's not a convincing argument. And there's a substantial, yet when it was awarded to Greece after World War II, Ankara had no say in the matter. Now, what happened after World War One? I think it was awarded to Greece after World War II. You talk about that. Okay. Keep in mind, by 1974, Turkey had become quite a strong state. So if you think about, that they, after World War One and after World War Two, the Western powers got to call the shots. They made the decision in after World War One for the exchange of populations between the Greece and Turkey. It was very cruel, very harsh, but both Greece and Turkey had to accept it. After World War II, again, Turkey was a very weak state. Not only was it very weak, but it faced a kind of a perilous situation where basically the Dardanelles could just be taken away from Turkey. The Soviet Union wanted to take the Dardanelles away from Turkey. But that's in 1945. By 1974, things had changed. As I say, I don't think a claim on the fact that we are the majority population, that is not sufficient. It never has been accepted as sufficient. One reason for that is there has to be a legal and a legally accepted process for determining the right of self-determination, a secession, and so on. Just simply saying, "Hey, we're the majority. We get a vote, and therefore, from one day to the next, there's a change in status." That's never been accepted in the international law. It's not accepted there. Just read the very good opinion issued by the Constitutional Court of Canada on the question of Quebec's secession. And they made clear that even if Quebec's referendum goes in favor of independence, that doesn't mean that anyone is obliged to do anything, that anyone has to be obliged to recognize Quebec's independence. So in the same way, because there has to be a legal process. And that was the fundamental crime in Yugoslavia, the fundamental crime in the dissolution of the Soviet Union, that there was no legal process that determined the people's destiny. So Yugoslavia just broke up, but there was no legal process for the breakup, and therefore it lacked any legitimacy. The Western powers rushed in to recognize the independence of Kosovo, and they talk, "Oh, we are demography and so on," but it was a fraud. It was just simply to their advantage, but there was no legal process that you could accept and say, "Well, why does Kosovo get to be independent?" So in the case of Cyprus, there was a status quo ante. There was an island. You had the Greeks and the Turks, ruled over by Macarius. Fundamentally, nothing as very much has changed. I mean, it's still, the only part that's changed is now it's been partitioned, but no one in the world has recognized the Turkish occupation of Cyprus. So, as I say, enosis was never going to happen. It was a silly thing to bring up, given the likelihood of a strong Turkish reaction. But in terms of what Turkey did in seizing the northern part of the island, no one has recognized it. Not one country recognizes that as somehow a permanent state of affairs, that's an independent state or belongs to Turkey. None of that has been done. Anyway, and then Vic goes on. I guess it is just by 1950s the Turkish realized that they are more important for the West. Where are we? Oh, here we are. Yeah. That they are more important for the West than Greece is, as you also said. So they pushed for their agenda on Cyprus. Well, they didn't push the agenda. I mean, it was the Greeks on the island. I forgot the name of the guy, the nutty guy, who was in Cyprus, Brigadier something or other. He was the leader of the Enosis movement in Cyprus, and he was always bad news. And the British knew that he was bad news, and they imprisoned him and Makarios imprisoned him. But so and he was, so there were these people who were pushing for this. It was always going to end in disaster. Um, but fundamentally, Turkey did not invade until this provocation. And I don't support the Turkish invasion. I think it was disproportionate. There was no legal justification for it. Whatever danger the Turkish Cypriots may have felt, and there really wasn't, was long gone. Makarios was restored almost immediately. But Turkey just seized the opportunity. But it was these Enosis Greeks who kind of provoked this crisis. Anyway, and then Vic goes on. So, the Turkish, really, they are more important than that. They push their agenda on Cyprus. Still, are you aware of why the 1974 invasion and a coup in Nicosia were attributed to the U.S. Kissinger? You know that during the invasion, Cypriot Greeks rioted in front of the U.S. embassy, and the ambassador was killed by sniper fire. No one was caught, though. Well, Kissinger, whenever he was asked about the Cyprus, and people said, "Hey, you supported the Turks," and he said, "Well, we didn't support the Turks. We just weren't watching this." Remember, this was in 1974. This was, you have the Watergate crisis in Washington. Clearly, the Nixon presidency was on its last legs. Kissinger was dealing with the shuttle diplomacy at the end of the Yom Kippur War. The shuttle diplomacy, they were basically working out all the disengagement agreements between Israel and Egypt, Israel and Syria. And then, of course, there was the détente and arms control agreements that was working on. So I don't think they were following it. It just wasn't high on the agenda. So when the crisis hit and Ankara made clear that they weren't going to stop, they were going to do it. I mean, I think the Americans said, "Well, what do we need to pick a fight here?" I mean, one other aspect of it, I guess, which is, and it's a long-standing issue, is there's always been a kind of an American tendency to support secular Muslims, who are really, really very useful, as opposed to these, not just even secular, but Muslims who could be useful. If they're pro-American, we can make use of them. And Greece, with its Orthodox Christians, they ultimately, you can go through crisis after crisis, and you'll find the Americans are always supporting Muslims against the Orthodox Christians. You see this time and again. You see this obviously in the case of Chechnya, where against the Americans were supporting the Chechens against the Orthodox Christian Russians. You see this clearly in the case of Yugoslavia, when the Americans embraced the cause of first the Muslims of Bosnia, then the Muslims of Albania, both times consistently against the Christian Orthodox Christians. So I think there was clearly a certain bias against the Greeks, and I think that helped make that decision for the Americans. So anyway, and then Robert says, the term anarcho-bureaucracy has arisen to describe the situation in the U.S., with its endless layers of agencies, courts, and commissions, each wielding veto power. Judges block executive orders, agencies defy presidents, and at the state and local level, regulatory red tape ties up new housing. I wonder whether Stalin's heavy handed rule was a reaction to similar sort of anarcho bureaucracy arising within the USSR. Well, so that's a very good question. I think it is an interesting thing. Now, is this a matter of anarcho bureaucracy, or whether this is an ideological conflict? I mean, you have an election. Trump wins the election in 2016, and the bureaucracy, the media, aligned with the opposition party, cook up a hoax, Russiagate, and almost bring the administration to its knees. There was no question, as soon as they came up with that hoax, there would be an impeachment, and it was still up in the air whether Trump could survive an impeachment trial. So they had that. That was the first term. Second term, Trump wins again. And again, just remember, between the first and the second terms, we have what's known as lawfare. Trump is tied up in. There are four separate four separate cases brought against him. Four separate jurisdictions, 2 state cases, 2 federal cases, and that's on top of the various civil suits against him. One inspired by the New York State government. And then, of course, you also have the legal attempts to throw him off the ballot. So all that was taking place during the interim period between Trump 1 and Trump 2. Then the moment you have Trump 2 wins the election decisively, you can't go back to Russiagate. Clearly, I think there were some people I think would have wanted to go back to Russiagate, but it's not going to happen. So you come up with something else, which is the moment Trump does anything, boom, there's always going to be some judge who will say, nope, you can't do it. Can't do it. It's against the law, against the Constitution, and so on. And what's important about this, again, it's part of lawfare, is that it gets mired in the legal and judicial process. Because, okay, you've now issued this nationwide injunction, and now Trump and the administration, rather, has to go through the legal process, which takes time. And during this process, nothing gets done. So it's actually a way of fighting against democracy. You basically say, okay, elections don't really matter very much, because you can just tie up a government, a government that's trying to fulfill its mandate. You say, okay, well, you can't do it. Judges told you can't do it. So I kind of wonder now that's really what it's just a way of fighting against the will of the people. And I think that's going to be, it's everything starts in the United States. All bad habits start in the United States, and then they spread to the rest of the world. And the Europeans have learned this is how you fight. That's why you saw this in Romania. You've seen that in France. You're now seeing this in Germany against the AfD, which is, hey, this is a neat idea. We can't really get our way through elections because we just, what we're selling is just is no one's buying, but we can fight it out in the courts. It's a narrow, specialized field. You got expertise. You've got all the people who go through the law schools, very smart people, and they know how to play this game. That's what they learn in the law schools, and boom, you can achieve remarkable political results without having to go through the cumbersome process of elections. So, um, so that's why I think we had the way when we say judges block executive orders, agencies defy presidents, yeah, um, and the state and local level regulatory red tape ties up new housing. Yeah, absolutely, all of that happens because the people who are in those agencies or in the courts, they want a certain outcome, and that there's nothing you can do about them because they have the power, and therefore the ballot becomes very unimportant. I mean, all of those things that they did. Remember those housing desegregation orders? That went on for years. I forgot that. Robert will probably remember that town in Yonkers. It was Yonkers. Remember how it went on for years, decades, where the courts were telling Yonkers how it's supposed to run its own affairs. So its entire city was being run by the courts, the regulatory agencies. They decide who gets housing in Yonkers and how they arrange these things. So it's a wonderful system to avoid any real political accountability. Anyway, thank you so much, Robert. And then Aristotle 1 says, thank you so much, Aristotle 1 says, was the Ukraine law against negotiating with the enemy not obviously just a way of stopping local mayors and officials from collaborating? It seems to be that as such, the law isn't controversial and isn't binding on the president. What do you think? Perhaps the law was badly drafted. Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, in the sense that it wasn't binding at all on the president. So Zelensky can go ahead and negotiate. I don't know whether that was the issue was on the on the level of the mayors, because I mean maybe that was it. I mean, as we've seen, when Ukraine took back territory from Russia, those who were deemed collaborators were dealt with very harshly. But that's true, I think, in any war, which is you've got to make a calculation if you're going to collaborate with the other side. You've got to make sure that side will be the winning side, because then, if it's not the winning side, you're going to pay a heavy price. So I tend to think that this law was just simply for show. That was important. I mean, I don't think you really needed a law. If you needed to pass a law just to tell local mayors, well, if the Russians come into your city, don't collaborate. I think the mayors would already know that if they do collaborate, the consequences could be quite dire. But I mean, ultimately, it's not such a big deal. I mean, these negotiations are now taking place in Istanbul. And Zelensky himself is not involved in them, and no one's getting prosecuted for negotiating with the Russians. So anyway, thank you so much, Aristotle. And then here we have we're talking about this ketamine is a painkiller for horses. Yeah, we talked about that earlier. And then Sinok says it's an anesthetic, but used to treat depression. I think that was why Musk was using this. and presumably that's what happened with Matthew Perry. And again, we'll continue with this on this ketamine. And then Robert says, incidentally, Steve Bannon says Lindsey Graham should be arrested for acting like a rogue diplomat in Ukraine, pushing war with Russia without Trump's okay. Well, I don't know whether you can arrest, but remember, that Logan Act, which I think is always nonsensical because it was a violation, I think, of the First Amendment. But nonetheless, since the Logan Act was used against Trump, I don't quite see why the Logan Act cannot be used against Lindsey Graham. Or if you're not going to do that, I think what you could do is, and I think somebody on Bannon's show advocated this, take away his passport, that you don't get to travel around the world because you're kind of posing as the foreign policy chief of the United States. You're usurping the powers of the presidency. Only the president gets to determine foreign policy, and yet you, Zelensky, you're meeting the French foreign minister. What are these meetings about? You're just a senator. These meetings are about you're telling them, hey, I'm in charge of a U.S. foreign policy, and I'm going to push for this piece of legislation, which is just exactly what you want. You, France, and Ursula, and that this is what you're looking for. This ridiculous sanctions bill. So we absolutely say, hey, he's basically usurping the powers of the presidency. Take away his passport. So, Marty, always very good to see you, Marty. Thank you so much, as always, for all of your generosity, your contributions, and in particular, always for your very, very funny and entertaining postings. And even he's put forward this picture. This is a touched up picture of Trump and Musk are in this picture, and it's touched up. I mean, it was Stalin, and I can't remember who was with Stalin in this photograph. But then but in the touched up version, you still saw Stalin, but the disappearance of the person, whoever was with Stalin. But I can't remember who was who was the other person in that in the original photo. But thank you. That's very, very funny. And then Vic says, I see you added Le Moment et Le Putain in the film poll. That's a very unique film. What do you like most about it? I assume you do like it since you added it to the list. I don't like it particularly. I don't hate it in the way I hated Le Chinoise, which I just thought was excruciating. I mean, at least I can watch Le Moment et Le Putain. I can watch it without just finding it just revolting and unwatchable. But I wouldn't say that I liked it very much. It did capture something of the atmosphere of the time. But I mean, it's just there was some France '68 and the whole thing. But I there's something about the that kind of the obnoxious young man played by Jean-Pierre Léaud, who was Godard's favorite Godard's favorite star and Francois Truffaut's star. So he, here's this lucky guy who's got two beautiful girlfriends, and gee, what a lot of problems he's getting because he's got two beautiful girlfriends. And then, lo and behold, he figures out, hey, why don't we all three of us live together in a menage a trois? I don't know. I found all that kind of somewhat childish and self-indulgent. So I think I like it only in the sense that it gives you a sense of the time. But I never particularly liked that whole kind of the self indulgence of the sort of young man, or maybe even middle aged man. Hey, aren't I cute? You know, I've got two beautiful girlfriends. I think I'll make a 4-hour film about what it's like to have two beautiful girlfriends, and then I come up with the idea. Hey, why don't we have a menage a trois? So so I don't much like it, but I added it as just the films of the time. To be honest, most of the films that I put on that list, I don't particularly like. If was a kind of an interesting film, also of its time. I like the Louis Malle film, the May Fools. I thought that was quite a good film. Weekend, so. So, but I can't say that any of those films are, I thought, well, I really like these the films. So, but I, it's a poll. It's not up to me. It's up to Gagglers to decide what they want to watch. So, so that's why I put them. But none of the films on that list would ever make my list of favorite movies. You say, well, what are your 10 favorite movies of all time? Nothing on that list is going to be in that top 10, or even that top 20, or even in the top 50. So anyway, Richard Phillips, good to see you. And so Yezhov was the one in that picture. Yeah. I thought it was probably Yezhov, but I couldn't remember was it Yezhov or Yagoda. But yeah, it was Yezhov who was in the picture that's just been, the one that's we're looking at with Stalin, and somebody was removed from it, and well, yeah, okay, so big is always bad in legislation. It seems Trump has been house trained. Okay, yeah. Petty vindictiveness, says Richard Phillips. Okay. I predicted that Musk would be out. Yeah. Yeah. And then Don Viejo says, why does George continue with the fiction that people's votes in Nasirim elections have been representative of anything but a paucity of choices? Well, I guess so. I mean, you're right, but ultimately we don't have any other measure than an election. And you say, well, okay, you won an election. I mean, I'm not saying that you are necessarily representative of the people, but you were the one who ran. I mean, you won the election, and therefore, I mean, I'm always amused by when they say, well, when you have these, RT used to do this kind of thing of, well, the people who in America who are the official candidates, well, they're no good. They don't represent anyone other than corporate interests. Let's have a look at the other candidates, and then here's somebody from the Libertarian Party, here's someone from the Constitution Party, and somebody else from some other party. And you say, well, let's have them on. We'll have a debate with them. And you listen to that. Some of them have interesting things to say. Some of them don't. But at the same time, I mean, how are people who get no votes? They run. They get no votes. How are they more representative than candidates who represent corporate interests? So I mean, so you've got a problem. And if you are going to say, well, you are the real candidate, you represent somebody other than yourself, then you have to say, well, what votes do you have? Otherwise, then, well, you just like him and you agree with him. But until you can show that you have real support, then you don't really represent anyone other than yourself. I mean, Nigel Farage stood for Parliament 7 times. He failed 7 times. you saw him a lot on television. He was entertaining on television, but when push came to shove, he couldn't persuade people to vote for him. Now it's a little different, and we'll see what happens now. Now he finally has persuaded people to vote for him, and then we'll see whether that is going to amount to anything. But I think that's all I'm saying is that ultimately, how else do we determine anything? And I think whatever drawbacks there are to Trump, we can say, look, he has now run 3 times. 3 times he won the Republican Party nomination. Probably 3 times he won the general election. Well, that's something. I mean, you have to accept that. And if you're like Musk and you pretend none of that matters, and that he must, because he poured a lot of money and he's the one who counts, then then you are accepting the premise, which is that, well, money is all that matters. Is corporate interests are all that matter, and that is very depressing. Anyway, politician is not a job. I agree. It's a diagnosis. Okay, fiat currencies and private property are ultimately incompatible. Ultimately, one party holds the 3D thing while the other holds. Okay, well, that's a lot of interesting ideas there. Can't really go into it now, but yeah, that's interesting. Anne Marie, always very good to see you. Thank you so much, Anne Marie, as always, for your great generosity. Anne Marie is a kind of musical expert, a musical scholar, and a professional musician. A distinguished orchestral performer, and we're really very lucky to have her among us and to enjoy her commentary on the Gaggle Music Club. So as always, really thank you so much, Anne Marie, and thank you for your generosity, and thank you for all your contributions. Aristotle says biggest misconception about World War II probably that it was a virtuous war, that it had to become a full world war and peace wasn't possible, and that Germany was worse than the UK and the USA and USSR. In short, that much the same propaganda was than today. Well, I wouldn't quite put it like that. I mean, I would agree that probably a world war could have been avoided. I think that I think is a. Now the issue of was Germany virtuous? The problem why I don't accept it, and normally I don't really like moralizing, but if you launch a war, and a war that is as catastrophic as that war was, then you have to bear the responsibility for all the catastrophic consequences. And that's why I'm not going to buy into that. Oh, well, they were all the same. I mean, David Irving, makes some defenses of Germany, and some of his arguments are more convincing than others. One of which is, I think, on the atom bomb. He didn't that Germany was not interested in the developing the atom bomb, and that Germany really wasn't interested in weapons of mass destruction, unlike the Western powers. I mean, I think that's but in terms of the catastrophic consequence, you ultimately have to hold the Hitler regime accountable for what it did. For that was a whatever we can talk about the British diplomacy and French diplomacy and whatever, but ultimately it was Hitler who took one gamble after another and risking each time that there'd be a world war. And what do you know? There was going to be a world war. That doesn't mean that the world war could not and should not have been stopped at an earlier stage, but nonetheless, it's if he hadn't done that, there probably would not have been a world war. Anyway, and it says So, hi, George Ambassador Bahadur Kumar talked to Glenn Deason yesterday about Russia's response to the attacks on the nuclear bombers. I never heard a diplomat, let alone Ambassador Bahadur Kumar, suggesting in a very strong terms that the time of diplomacy is over and Russia has finally to demonstrate they're not a paper tiger and not to worry what China and India may say. Well, I mean, he has said things along that line. I mean, I think in his columns, he has suggested that. And I tend to agree with that. I think Russia has shown itself to be, you know, indecisive. And therefore, it has shown itself to be afraid to escalate. And or to not so much to escalate, afraid to take seriously the threats to its security. Whereas NATO, the British, the Americans have step by step kept pushing against Russia, kept crossing Russia's red lines, and they always figured that Russia, in the end, would not dare to escalate. That's their feeling, is that, and I think what's happened, and we've said this before, what's happened in this conflict is we've seen the limits of deterrence. And it doesn't matter if you have nuclear weapons, if you're not willing to risk the use of nuclear weapons, then that's it. Nuclear weapons are quite useless. And that's what the NATO powers have figured out. They say, well, Russia's not going to escalate, because if they escalate, then there's always a good likelihood that nuclear weapons will be used. And if nuclear weapons are going to be used, then Russia is going to be hurt very badly by nuclear weapons. I mean, everybody else would be, but Russia would also. And since there's no rational interest in committing national suicide, they say, well, then Russia isn't going to use nuclear weapons, and that means Russia is not going to escalate to the situation where nuclear weapons might be used. And therefore, we can take any risks we like, because we know Russia isn't going to take the next escalatory step. And I think that's really has been the problem, which means that Russia comes across as weak. They comes across as not daring to risk a confrontation with NATO, while NATO is willing to risk a confrontation with Russia. So NATO is willing to take the risk, Russia isn't, and that's unfortunately it hasn't worked out very well for anyone for the past few years. Anyway, Summer Petros, always very good to see you. Thank you, Summer Petros. Thank you for your contribution. And Richard Phillips, you mentions Yezhov. Yezhov was tried and executed. His likeness was removed from the image. I don't know whether Yezhov actually was tried. I mean, I think he was executed, but I don't know if there was actually a trial. I mean, there's often they say, "Oh, there's a trial. It was in secret." But if there was a trial, is there a transcript? And if there's no transcript, and I've never seen a transcript of this of a Yezhov trial, then one has to assume there was no trial. He was just simply shot, and that's true. I think with a lot of these secret trials and executions is that there really wasn't a trial, because if there were, then there would be a legal process that you could look through. A trial transcript, the preliminary hearings, the arrest warrant, detention records, all of that. None of that exists. So one has to assume that many of these people, like Yezhov or the famous Red Army generals, Tukhachevsky, Yakir, were just simply executed on the spot. There was no trial. Anyway, thank you everybody for. Oh, I think it's the end of the thing. Okay. so much, everybody who raised a lot of interesting questions, challenging questions. Some people are not happy with my answers. It goes with the territory. But thank you above all for those who contributed to the tip jar to enable us to do the journalism we do here. And particularly the dogs, to say, yeah, we're doing all this journalism, and we're not getting paid for it. I mean, that's their position. And so, but anyway, thank you so much, and we will be back. So over the weekend, we're going to have a few podcasts with Peter, and we've got a special guest at some point over the weekend, so that should be interesting. And then next Monday we'll have the joint live stream with Peter, and then Tuesday will be time for my solo. So hope everybody can join me. Look forward to meeting you then. All the best. Good night. Bye-bye. See you.